1972 så stod Olof Palme värd för FNs första miljökonferens här i Stockholm. I hans inledningstal så sa Palme: "Jag är övertygad om att vi kan finna lösningar, men det är absolut nödvändigt att vi samarbetar internationellt. Det är verkligen mycket bråttom. Lösningar kommer att kräva långtgående förändringar i samhällets organisation." Nästan 50 år senare så kan vi konstatera att nödvändiga förändringar har uteblivit och tiden är än mer knapp. Nu krävs att vi i rekordfart tar oss an en gigantisk omställning. Men hur kan vi göra det på ett sätt som samtidigt värnar arbetstagares rättigheter och att vi kan närma oss målet om social rättvisa? Planen för det heter Just Transition, rättvis omställning. Vi ska nu få träffa Ann Pettifor, ekonom och hjärnan bakom Green New Deal, och Sofia Östmark, generalsekreterare på den fackliga organisationen Union to Union. Samtalsledare gör Cajsa Unnbom, min kollega från Olof Palmes Internationella Center.
Right, hi, and thank you for joining us for this conversation about a just transition. As you know, we need dramatic action to protect the living conditions on this planet. We're already seeing very dramatic effects of the climate crisis. And it is at heart a crisis also about justice, because we know that there's a small minority of people on Earth, the richest people, who are responsible for most of the emissions, whereas those who are hit the hardest and the first are the people who have done very little to cause the crisis. And at the same time, we're also losing the fabric of life that sustains us. About 2/3 of the animals and the plants have disappeared off the face of the earth since the 1970s. And the world is currently not doing enough to respond to these crises. We're heading for about 3 degrees of warming if we continue as we do now. And in Sweden, we do have relatively progressive climate policies. But even so, we would need to do about more than double in order to achieve the Paris Agreement, according to a recent study from Uppsala University. So we really need to speed up the efforts to cut the emissions and to create a new green economy. And in this case, succeeding slowly is the same as failing, and we can't afford to fail. In this historic transitions, all sectors of the economy have to be a part. So all jobs have to be green jobs. So we're really at the beginning of a major shift. And what the just transition means is that this transition needs to be fair. We have to make sure that the costs don't fall unfairly on low-income communities, and we have to make sure that the workers' rights are protected in this big shift. So the just transition is a plan that comes from the unions, and it demands that when we do this transition, that the workers have to be a part of it. They have to be a part of designing how it's going to be. So what the just transition is it's no less than a plan to save the earth from climate collapse, while we also create lots of decent jobs and make our societies more equal. So in 40 minutes from now, I hope that we will all have a better understanding of what the just transition is about and how we're going to go about achieving it and who needs to be involved. And here to help us get us there, I have 2 people who are pushing for a just transition in their respective areas. We have Sofia Östmark, who's Secretary General of Union to Union, which is the joint international development organization of all the Swedish trade unions. So very welcome.
Thank you very much.
And with us on link, we also have Ann Pettifor, the Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, which is a network whose mission is to find a sustainable economic model. She's also been the economic advisor of the British Labour Party. And you were also part of the group of economists who devised the original Green New Deal. So we're very excited to have you here. And you've also recently written a book about the Green New Deal called The Case for the Green New Deal.
Translated in Swedish.
Wonderful. I have it with me, actually. Right. And my name is Cajsa Unnbom, and I work with climate and environment issues here at the Palmes Center, at the Olof Palmes International Center. As you're listening, I hope that you will have lots of questions for our panelists, so please put those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. But just to get things started, I would like to ask both of you to explain what the just transition is in just one sentence. Sophia, are you up to the task?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Thank you very much, Cajsa. And as you were saying, just transition is really about addressing the decent work deficit and the climate crisis at the same time. And just transition covers both measures to ensure that those that lose their jobs or livelihood as a consequence of climate change are handled, and also measures to ensure that new green jobs are also good jobs and decent work.
Thank you. Right. Ann Pettifor, what do you say?
Well, I mean, I've quite a lot to say, but let me start by saying that the just transition is the very reverse of what was done to the coal mine workers here in Britain by Margaret Thatcher and her government. They were stripped of their jobs, and their communities were stripped of income, and they were left, if you like, desolate. There was no effort to retrain or to move workers into new well-paid jobs equivalent to what they were earning then, or even better. But above all, there was no conceptual and help workers adjust and move. It was brutal, and so the just transition is the very reverse of that. It's acknowledging that there are some industries, some sectors that are really going to be harmed, are already harmed, if you like, by climate breakdown. And I'm thinking, for example, of airline workers already suffering the consequences of a pandemic which was caused in the first instance by by humanity invading the space of wildlife. And then that's where the transfer of the virus went. So, you know, we already have the consequences with us. And the question now is, where is the political will to ensure that workers in industries that are going to become irrelevant or have to become irrelevant, where is the will to train up and redesign work? And God knows there is so much work that needs to be done to tackle this crisis, and to employ their skills and ensure that they make a contribution. That, for me, would be a just transition.
Thank you. You've already started talking a little bit about why it is so important, but I would just like to phrase the question like that as well. Why is it so important with a just transition?
I think there are several reasons, but I think we should take the opportunity of greening our economies to also make sure that we tackle the existing inequalities that we see are rising in many countries around the world. And just transition really provides this opportunity to address both the climate change, but also the social and economic perspectives of a sustainable development. So I think that is why we should do it. And if you look at the changes and the transformation on the labor market and in this work to address climate change, jobs will be lost, as we have heard here. New jobs are also being created, and other jobs are being transformed. But this might not happen at the same time. So it's really three things that we have to do. We have to protect the workers whose work will be lost, but we also have to ensure that the new jobs are good jobs and that we have the right skills to have those, and also at the right places. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has estimated that the new green jobs will be created, about 24 million new jobs, so it's quite a lot. And at the same time, 6 million jobs will be lost. So there will be a net gain, but we don't know where these new jobs will be created, and do we have the right skills, as Ann was saying as well. So this is why it's really important. And if we look at the society and the Sustainable Development Agenda, which we only have 9 years soon to reach, we really need to have the environmental, the economic, and the social dimensions of sustainable development to go hand in hand. So I think this is why just transition is extremely important at our time, both in our economies here in Sweden, but also in low and middle income countries where this is really a big challenge.
Thank you.
So for me, you know, we really have to be careful that we're not talking aspirationally here. You know, we are very good at saying this is what must happen. We're very good at saying that this should be done. And so we like the word should and we like the words must. But we cannot do this within a framework in which our democracy is before our eyes being dismantled, or where our democracy is crumbling away. And so for me, there is now a moment of struggle. You know, this is going to take struggle. It's not going to take wishful thinking. It's not going to take fine policy announcement, and it's not going to take real facts. You know, the ILO numbers are very encouraging, but that ain't enough for Labour to capture, to seize and hold political power. And for me, that is the task that we face. And it's a task we face at a moment when social democracy across Europe and in my country is in a state of dire weakness, if not crumbling, basically. You know, the Labour Party in Britain has just been defeated massively by a small bunch of, if I may be very crude, crooks, essentially, who have very little regard for our democratic institutions. And that, of course, exactly the same thing is happening in the United States. So I worry that we're a bit complacent because we know what's good and we're full of fine ideas and we write wonderful books, and I speak for myself here, but that ain't enough. We now have to organize to seize and hold political power. Now, I'm encouraged very much by what's happening in Europe and by the Green Deal. Of course, it's inadequate, you know, and we can complain about there's not enough money for it and so on. But what we're beginning to see in Europe, which we don't see elsewhere, is the beginnings of political will, right? And institutions taking on that political will. But I think, you know, when you look at what's happening in Hungary and in Poland, you know, it's severely at risk. So for me, this is where the unions are absolutely vital, because political parties really don't have the structures needed for organization, for organizing working people. The unions have these structures. So we really have to have a massive push to strengthen and widen and deepen the trade union movement, in my view, in order to seize and hold political power. And if I may just ramble on a bit longer, the left loves to talk fine language, loves to talk about how good we are at dreaming about a future, right? We don't like to talk about seizing and holding political power. It seems to us to be a nasty business. The right have no such illusions, right? They want political power. You know, we see what's happening in the United States, how hard the right will fight and ignore all institutions in order to grab political power. I really want to see that instinct in European social democracy too, before we can hope for a just transition.
Right, thank you. So go out and get power, basically, is the recipe. But do you think if we devise a just transition that we will get enough popular support for the transition? Because my understanding is that it is a little bit weak at the moment. You don't see that popular push yet. So if we put justice into the mix, do you think that it will create the support that we need?
I think we need to, I do think we need to highlight the fact that 10% of the people responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, you know, the richest people, are responsible for 75% of emissions. So we ought to understand the problem isn't with me and you, ordinary householders. You know, we can change our behavior. The problem was with the structure of our economy, which has given so much power to that 10%. And that 10% is the global 10%. They've globalized themselves. They're all over the world. They move their money as they like. They decide whether or not to pay taxes and where they want to pay taxes. They have enormous power. And we sit at home worrying about what's happening here on our doorstep. We sit at home worrying about behavioral change and community change. You know, all of that's rather beautiful, when actually what we need is structural change. Structural change not just to our economies, but to the global economy, right? That means we need international trade union alliances to work for that structural change and to work together for that structural change, and to understand that we have to achieve that, in a sense, before we can save the planet. And it sounds huge, but I know we can do it because we've done it before, and I'll say more about that.
Great. Yes, Sofia.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with what Ann says, and I also think you were saying, how do we get this public push for a just transition? And as you were mentioning in the beginning, just transition comes from the trade union movement. They started to talk about it in the 90s, maybe even before that. But what I see now is that it is on the table much more than I feel that the just transition was just 10 years ago. So I think there is an understanding that social justice and climate justice needs to go hand in hand. So I think we're starting to see a push for that and a public opinion that understands why this is so important. So I'm quite encouraged that we are moving in the right direction. But then again, as Ann was saying, we cannot just only talk about it, we need to act as well and make things practical on the ground.
Perfect. That is a very good bridge to the next question, which is how are we going to do this big transformation? And I was wondering if you could start to talk a little bit about the international development cooperation sector and how it can be done there.
Yeah. No, as you were saying also in the beginning, Union to Union is the Swedish trade unions or movement's organization for international development cooperation. So we work with 27 of the Swedish trade unions. All Swedish trade unions are part of us as an organization. So it's everything from doctors to painters or all workplaces basically. And we work with around 60 projects around the world. Some of them are focused on just transition, and just to mention maybe one practical thing that we are working with together with the Swedish trade union SECO and the International Transport Federation is the kind of transition in many African countries from matatus, the small buses that you see when you are in many capitals in Africa. And then they are moving to more big buses that are both better for the climate, but also for the infrastructure and public transport and the roads and so on. But in this, when they started, it's called bus rapid transport. And when they started, they didn't really think about all the jobs and all the matatu drivers that would lose their jobs. So they were not really involved in or included in the discussions with the government and with the different companies and international institutions. But the project that we have here is focusing on how can we have a social dialogue where the workers that are affected of this transition are actually in the conversation and making sure so that the trade union in Kenya, for example, is positive towards this transformation. But they want to make sure that it's done in a way that people are not losing their jobs. The new jobs that are transformed are good jobs and decent work, and also looking at how can people reskill to make sure that they can drive buses and so on. So it's about making sure that trade unions are at the table when discussing issues that are of concern for them and the workers that are organized. So that's a specific project that we are working on. When you hear discussions about just transition, it's very much often from Canada or Spain, where you hear good examples where there has been a good social dialogue between trade unions, employer organizations and governments. But little focus, we feel, have been on developing countries or low and middle income countries. So we have also taken initiative to a study which we have done with what is called Just Transition Center, something that is put up with from the I2C, the International Trade Union Confederation. And that is looking at some examples from countries where trade unions are engaging in just transitions on the country level and seeing what more can international development cooperation do over time. So this study will be released in the beginning of November, and we hope that it will spur a conversation and make sure that just transition is also on the table of international development cooperation donors, because there we don't see much progress yet.
And what would you say in the political arena, which is your field, what needs to be done? How do you do this?
First of all, can I just insert here a little story? In 1972, I was standing, and I think it was 72, on the streets of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, when Olof Palme visited. And I can't tell you the love and the support and the enthusiasm that greeted him in Tanzania at that time, and the goodness, the good stuff that Sweden has done in developmental terms. Sweden has been ahead of everybody at the World Bank and in development generally, and you have a very wonderful record to be proud of. But this is not a development issue. This is not about being kind to the poor Black people in Africa, and I speak as an African, right? This is about structural change to the international system that makes people in Kenya and in Tanzania poor, deliberately, and that elevates the 1% in Tanzania and in Kenya, right? So that the 1% in Kenya and Tanzania today are doing very, very well and are pretty corrupt, actually, just as they are in Britain and the United States. This is a function of the international financial system, which was constructed effectively by Western neoliberals, to put it crudely, right, by economists like Hayek and Friedman and so on. So it's that system which is polarizing society and also impoverishing not just the people of Tanzania and Kenya, but the people of the United States and Britain and Europe, you know. So it's that system. And I would like to see the unions take more of an interest in, look, this is not about being kind to the poor. This is about changing the system. And we want to work with the poor in Tanzania and Kenya to change the international system. And I think, in a sense, that was Olof Palme was about that, you know. So I want us to see it much more in those terms, because we tend to be benevolent. We tend to be thinking about, oh, we've got to transfer our money across to people who don't have money. No, we have to change the system which disables them from raising the finance they need to tackle the just transition. You know, they can do it on their own. They really don't need us to help. But if we cripple them with an international financial system which allows investors to steal, for example, their oil or their gas or any of their rich assets and take the profits from that away without paying taxes, that is a result of the international financial system which was designed in the West. That is the thing that has to change.
And how do we do that? What big political decisions are needed?
I ran an international campaign called Jubilee 2000 for the cancellation of the debts of the poorest countries. And when we began, everybody said, oh, this is, you know, nirvana. It's crazy. You can't do this. You can't get people interested in the complicated international financial system, which benefits creditors, but actually punishes poor country debtors, right? And makes them pay for everything. And with creditors always winning and never losing. And they said that you can't explain that to the public. And anyway, the public are all selfish and they just care about, we changed that. Within 5 or 6 years, we transformed the debate and we persuaded the big official creditors to write off about $100 billion of debt for 30 countries, right? And the way we did that was, first, we raised awareness. We explained the international financial architecture to women sitting in their kitchens listening to the radio and doing the housework and trying to understand, right? We said, look, this is not rocket science. You could get this. And when you get this, you'll understand why it's so unfair, why it's so unjust, right? And sure enough, they did. And then we would help organize. We would say, look, the G8 are coming to Birmingham in 1998. Will you turn up and tell them that you want to see the debt cancelled? And the G8 thought, oh, this is a joke. Nobody's going to do this. Who cares about the poor? And who cares about African countries getting into debt, you know? And anyway, who understands it? And 100,000 people turned up at that demonstration, right? And the G8 were forced to cancel the debts, even the most, you know, hard-minded about this. So it starts with awareness. At the moment, we don't talk about the international system. It's a secret. We talk about our domestic economies, what's happening here at home, what we care about here. We don't understand that there's an architecture of which we are part, right? And so I think that understanding has to spread, and the unions can play a part in that. And we can understand why it is that Apple doesn't pay taxes in Europe, but shunts all its money across to Ireland where it can get a tax break. You know, why? How does that happen? Is Apple just evil? No. We have created the system which makes it easy for Apple to do that, which is why the General Court of Europe supported Apple. They said, you're obeying the law. Here in London, we had a panorama program on Monday, which told us about London being a laundry for the most corrupt oligarchs from all parts of the world. London is the biggest laundry for their money, right? For dirty, illicit money. So the point was, everybody shock horror. You know, these guys are bad, evil. No, they're not. They're obeying the law. The banks are obeying the law. The law says you can move your money without any effort. You can simply move it. If you want to move labor, or if you want to move goods and services, you come up against barriers. But not if you want to move money. We'll make it easy for you. And we did. And that is what we have to get to understand. The banks are not crooks. They're obeying the law. And I think in a sense it's that when people understand, one of the joys of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, and I always tell the story, and I will repeat telling the story because it's so powerful. The Treasury came to me and they said, what the hell is going on here? Senior officials in the Treasury, Gordon Brown was stunned by it. He was the Chancellor. They are getting letters from women on pink pieces of paper with a bunch of roses in the corner saying, "Dear Sir, I understand the agreement that you've reached for debt relief for Uganda is based on a cut-off date, which you've chosen as 1981. I find this totally unacceptable." He said, "Who told them about Uganda's cut-off date?" I said, "We told them. You know, it's not rocket science. You don't have to be a genius to understand this stuff." And so by that means, we empowered people. Once they understood, then actually organizing was pretty easy.
Right. Sophia, you also had something to say there.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to come back to what Ann was saying about structural changes and also the power of organization or trade unions, actually. Because at the same time, when we see that trade unions and organization can play an important role, we also see that the space and the democratic space to organize oneself in a trade union or in other organizations for that matter is shrinking. The Global Rights Index that is coming every year from the International Trade Union Federation shows a negative spiral for 10 years now on trade unions being murderers. The right to be organized in a trade union or registered a trade union is decreasing in many countries. So it is about structural changes in the countries. It's about political power in these countries. So we see that trade unions also density, I mean the number of people that are organized in a trade union in different countries are also decreasing. And this is worrying because if we want this change that is building on making sure that we are a society with less inequality, I think trade unions are a key force there. And that's why we have to put also a lot of effort in making sure that you have the democratic space to organize yourself in a union and making sure that you have the social dialogue between the trade unions, the employer organizations and the governments. And in order to have that, you have to have the capacity. How do you engage in social dialogue? So there I think there is also pointing in the importance of international trade union development cooperation and cooperation among different trade unions. So I think this is really one key issue in making sure that we have a just transition. We also have to have democratic, representative and strong trade unions that can take part and be a strong part at the table.
So building power is essential to get this shift underway. I wanted to ask you to open for some questions from the audience as well. When you think of the just transition, the image that comes to mind is sort of only the male-dominated sectors, the oil sector, the transportation sector, the building sector. How does this concern women? Is there an equality perspective here that we need to be aware of?
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, me first?
Sure.
So for me, I'm currently working with the Women's Budget Group in Britain, and we're about to issue a report saying that the economic recovery has to be a care-led recovery. Women are mainly in the care professions, right? Health, education, adult care, child care, and palliative care, right? And that work is so important to the transition, mainly because of what we see happening at the moment, how important health workers are to our very survival, never mind care, right? But equally, it's also not greenhouse gas emitting. It's the kind of service work that we're going to need to have much more of in order to have a sustainable ecosystem as well as a sustainable economy. So women's work actually should come to the fore because it is the most important work for our survival, but also because it's not toxic, basically, like so much of manufacturing. And so far, you know, manufacturing workers have always been valued and paid high salaries. Women's work has never been valued properly and paid high salaries. And what was very striking about the pandemic for me is that I watched as footballers sat on their butts, not being able to kick a ball around, right? Despite being paid millions of pounds, millions of dollars, right? Oligarchs found themselves, stranded, except perhaps for Jeff Bezos at Amazon. We relied for the very existence of the economy on health workers, truck drivers, shelf stackers, the people who made our food available, right? Without those people, we would have died. There's no question about it. We all had that feeling of panic. We knew we had to panic buy in order to ensure that we could survive this thing. And we survived because of those workers. And what I want us to understand is that that's our power, but we don't accept that's our power. We don't understand that it's power. We think the footballer has got power because he can earn $1 million. No, we are the ones with power. And I just want us to understand we make the economy. And when we understand that, we have to use that power. We have to say, sorry, but we're going to withhold our power. We're going to withhold our work unless you pay us more. And you recognize the quality of our work and you help upskill us and upgrade our work. So, for me, it's terribly important, women's work, because that's the kind of work that's going to be vital to the planet.
Thank you. Sofia, what do you say about the equality aspect or the gender aspect?
No, I agree. I mean, this is very much linked to a just transition and making sure that we have an equal society for men and for women. And as you were saying, maybe what you see when you think about the just transition is a co-worker, often a man, and also a report that just came from ILO and the Inter-American Development Bank pointed out that 80% of the jobs, the new kind of green jobs that will be created, will be in male-dominated sectors. So here we have to think about how can, look at new norms. I mean, women can work. It's about reskilling, as you were saying. I mean, changing the attitudes towards what is a work for a man and what's a work for a woman as well. But also the service sector, as Ann was pointing out, where women are mostly and valuing the work that women are doing. So I think having a gender lens on a just transition is extremely important, but it's also the core in making sure that we have an equal and a just transition and a just society.
Yeah. Thank you. A question for you, Ann. You've been writing a lot about the Green New Deal. How would you explain the relationship between a just transition and the Green New Deal?
Well, I don't think there's any hope for it unless it's just. And I don't think there's any hope for us actually achieving that transformation until we mobilize public support for it. The thing about the Green New Deal is that it's modeled on what President Roosevelt did in 1933. And the things that he did, and the reason why it's so inspiring to me, and let's face it, he wasn't a perfect president. There was an awful lot that was wrong, that was racist about what he did, actually, about his policies. So, and actually also gender misogynist. For example, he set up these camps of workers to plant trees across the whole of the Great Plains of the United States, because they had an environmental crisis. It was called the Dust Bowl, right? They had destroyed and eroded their soils, and they needed to plant trees to restore health to the soil. But he excluded women from those camps against the advice of his wife, who was very angry about that. And he also excluded black people. He had black so there's lots that's imperfect about Roosevelt. So I have no illusions. But the great thing is that on the night of his inauguration, he had lots of time to prepare, to be fair. On the night of his inauguration, he dismantled the gold standard, which was the international financial system that governed everything at that time. In other words, it was an international financial system governed by Wall Street. And as his governor of the Federal Reserve said, we moved the government from Wall Street into my office, into the Treasury, into the presidency. That's what he did on the night. He said, we don't want to be part of the gold standard. I would like the banks to hand over their gold tomorrow. And his staff said, you can't do it on a Sunday. So they had Monday, and they had what is called a bank holiday, right? And that bank holiday is always described as if Roosevelt was saving the banks. No, he was saving the economy, because he forced the banks to get off the gold standard, which was a system of liberalized, deregulated global finance. And then that enabled the government to mobilize the finance that is needed for the great transition that happened then. They had both a massive unemployment crisis and they had a massive ecological crisis. And he tackled both by creating jobs, but he had to finance that. And he gave the government the power, which could then not be eroded by Wall Street, to mobilize that finance, create jobs. And the great thing, and I really want us to get this all into our heads, the very good thing about creating jobs and creating well-skilled and highly paid jobs is that the ones that benefit are not just the workers, it's not just society. The government benefits because it gets more tax revenues, which can be used to pay down the deficit. The reason our public deficits are completely out of sync at the moment is because we have either high unemployment in places or we have full employment, but it's insecure, part-time, precarious employment where the workers aren't paying any taxes. And as a result, the public finances are in a mess and we get blamed for it, right? If we were paid better, we would improve the public finances. And that's what he did. You know, and he stumbled on the way and he made mistakes. But fundamentally, that's what he did to restore jobs to the American people and to restore the environment that had been so degraded. I mean, they subsequently degraded it all over again. But that model is the model that I think we need to follow, and that's why it's called the Green New Deal.
Right. Thank you. We do have historical precedents to look to, even though we're we're up against something that we haven't done before. We have a lot to look back at. That is true. We're nearing the end of the talk. I would just like to ask you one final question, which is, if you imagine 10 years from now, say, when we look back at what we have achieved, we have done this just transition in the time frame that the climate science gives our richer countries. What was it that made us succeed?
If I start, I mean, I think it is a lot about building organizations. So building trade union density that makes then workers have a representative part in the discussions that are affecting their lives, making sure then that trade unions are at the table so that there will build social cohesion between the different parties. It's about alliance building. I think we have to think also in new ways of working. Trade unions together with civil society organization and green organization in a way that we aren't working so well in all the places right now. I also think one important aspect is about social protection. So social protection schemes, training and restructuring and retraining and reskilling will be extremely important so that we have figured out how we can kind of transform this ourselves, our skills, to new jobs, new realities. It will be a lot that will be needed from all of us, but I think it's about organizing ourselves a lot to make sure that the structures are different, the power relations are different. There is a discussion among the ones that are affected by climate change and changes on the labor market. So those are some of the things that I think we have to succeed with if we should look back in 10 years or 15 years to see what we should have done to achieve this.
Thank you. And Anne?
So I couldn't agree more with Sofia. She's absolutely right about how we need to organize, but also how we need to build alliances. You know, there's so much sectarianism in the labor movement. Oh, I'm better than you. I'm more left-wing than you. I'm more right-wing than you. I'm more politically pure than you are. You know, we get all of that stuff. Our job is to bring over our enemies to our side, right? I mean, we learned that with the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn. We were so busy all agreeing with each other. We didn't realize we had to convert not just the public, but also our own party. You know, there were elements in our party that didn't understand what we were talking about and didn't like what we were talking about. We were too proud to say, look, can we talk to you and explain to you what we mean by our proposals? No, we thought we were going to win and we were all okay. And, you know, that arrogance has to go. We have to be humble enough to know that we have to win over, for example, at its extreme level, the people that vote for Trump, right? Those people are angry, they're frightened, they've lost their jobs, they think there must be a big bad guy and they call it China. and their president tells them it's China, so they believe their president, because would their president lie to them? You know, we've got to be able to talk to those people and bring them into our camps. We've got to talk to people we're not used to talking to, and we've got to bring them over to us. And we don't have to do that by patronizing them, but by engaging with them fully. But I think non-sectarianism is going to be so important. Let's not think ourselves too proud. You know, the thing about the Jubilee 2000 Coalition, which I'm boasting here a bit, but it was extremely successful. We talked to the churches, we talked to the Muslims, we talked to the medical professionals, we brought on all the unions, we brought on right-wing conservatives, quite a few of the Brexiters today were part of the Jubilee 2000 movement. Right?
Yeah, thank you. I think the message we're getting.
Thing to do, and I think that's really the way forward.
Yes. So talk to the people and definitely involve not just the workers, but the citizens, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So what we've heard is that there are so many things that we can get started on to get this transition going and speed it up. And even though there's a lot at stake, I think it's also like a great opportunity for our progressive movements to start building the world that we want to see. So thank you so much, Sofia Östmark and Ann Pettifor, for being here today and talking to us about a just transition. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.